Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. I feel like today was the first day that it's felt truly wintry. So, braving this cold to come out to hear Lisa Gardiner this evening, I really appreciate it. It's going to be a great talk. I'm very excited. We're always pleased to collaborate with Princeton University Press. They're amazing partners. And also, this is co-presented by the Princeton Environmental Film Festival as well as the library. It's sort of like a wonderful synchronicity in that libraries really want to think about different types of literacy, including environmental literacy. And so being able to have a book that also aligns with the film festival is really wonderful. We're excited to plan it. It's going to, we're in the midst of planning it. It'll come out March 27th is the first day. So save that time in your calendar. Lisa is a science writer, educator, scientist, and speaker. Her second nonfiction book, Reefs of Time, What Fossils Reveal About Coral Survival, is now available. She's the author of the award-winning book, Tales from an Uncertain World, What Other Assorted Disasters Can Teach Us About Climate Change. She aims to help curious readers learn about how our planet works and how our actions affect climate, ocean, and ecosystems. She holds a PhD in geoscience with a focus on paleoecology. I didn't even know that was a thing. It's exciting. From the University of Georgia, an MFA in nonfiction writing from Goucher College, and a BA in geology and marine science from Smith College. After her presentation, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. We do ask that you wait for me to bring you the microphone so that it's easier for everyone in the room to hear. This room is T-coil enabled, so if you have a T-coil enabled device, please feel welcome to turn it on at this time. If you'd like to use some of our headsets, we have them at the back of the room. But just wait for me to bring you a microphone, I'll remind you. And also don't forget, we have Susan here from Labyrinth Books, our favorite local bookstore and booksellers. So please make sure to buy a book after the talk, and you'll have an opportunity to say something to Ms. Gardiner, who will sign it at that time. Great, thank you. Please join me in welcoming Lisa.
Well, hi, everyone. I am so glad to be here with you all today and tell you a bit about this book, Reefs of Time, What Fossils Reveal About Coral Survival. And because it was published by Princeton, it seems very fitting to be right here. And so I feel like I came to the book's birthplace. So I really like that. So the book is about coral reefs, past and present. So tonight, we're going to meet some corals that are surviving tough times underwater today, like the photo in the middle of this slide. And here I am trying to hover above a reef while taking notes underwater. And if you're planning to write a book, I would not recommend writing it underwater. This is very challenging, and I really, on dry land is much more preferable, but taking some notes underwater was super helpful for setting the scene and describing places and that sort of thing. So, and then we're gonna look at some past coral reefs too. And we're going to look into reef history, including evidence from fossil corals like the ones on the right here. So reefs, as you probably know, are in the middle of a crisis right now, and it can be hard to have perspective when you're in the middle of a crisis. I suppose that's true of any crisis, but it's also true of the coral reef crisis. And knowing where things are headed in uncertain times is, of course, very challenging, but I think history can help give us some of that perspective and help us understand what have coral reefs been through in the past, and what have they survived, and what have they not been able to survive. So that can help us have some perspective on what's happening now. So as Kim mentioned, I'm a science writer and an educator, but my training is as a paleoecologist and a geologist. And paleoecology is the science of ancient ecosystems. So it's not just identifying fossil species, but rather who lived together in this environment. And so reconstructing those environments. And fossil reefs, especially very young ones, can give us a picture of what coral reefs were like before we started harming their environment. And so that's where I was focused when I was doing that sort of research. But both of those science fields, paleoecology and geology, focus on the past. Generally what went on in the past. And then I went into climate education, and that tends to focus on what's projected for the future. I mean, not all the time, but often we're interested in where things are headed. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the past and the future. And it's possible I don't live in the present enough, but that, the past and the future are really what inspired this book. So here is a fossil coral reef. This rocky coast is full of fossils, and we're going to zoom in and take a look at a couple of them. This is on the west side of the island of San Salvador in the Bahamas, and this is where I started thinking about what coral reefs were like in the past, and how they lived before pollution, before overfishing, before human-caused climate change. And I was doing research there for my dissertation about 25 years ago, and I didn't think to write a book back then. That only came to mind during the pandemic when we weren't allowed to travel anywhere anymore. And my mind sent me back to places like this. But I wrote Reefs of Time because there's been such an interesting body of research about what reefs were like in the past, from this fossil reef and from a lot of other fossil reefs, as well as from not yet fossilized reefs, so from other evidence too. And we'll talk a bit about that. But there's also such huge questions about whether coral reefs will even have a future. And so, understanding more about the past can help us understand that as well. So this fossil reef, you'll notice it's on land. Coral reefs are not on land. They're at the bottom of the sea. And so something has changed here. This fossil reef formed 125,000 years ago when sea level was about 20 feet higher than it is today. This was the previous interglacial period. We're in an interglacial period now. So glaciers are relatively small, and sea level is relatively high, but sea level was even higher 125,000 years ago or thereabouts. And so that's why this former seafloor with its corals and other reef animals, the fossils thereof, are now on land. And there are fossil reefs from this same time frame on the edges of a lot of tropical islands, and on islands that are uplifting because of plate tectonics. You wind up with stair steps of reefs from different ages. So it's kind of like a big escalator of reefs coming up onto land in those sorts of places. So there's a lot of evidence of what these reefs were like in the past. And if you're used to thinking about much older fossils, dinosaurs, trilobites, things like that, then 125,000 years probably seems impossibly young. And if you're used to thinking about living coral reefs, then 125,000 years probably seems incredibly old. So I commiserate in either case. But the idea of using these very young fossils to understand reefs today comes from the fact that most of the coral species in these past reefs are still alive today. So, for instance, on the left here, we've zoomed into that fossil reef, that rocky coast on San Salvador, and we're looking at a branch of staghorn coral. And so this was a type of coral that used to be very common in the Caribbean. And on the right is a staghorn coral alive in a reef just offshore, off the coast of San Salvador. And it's got that yellowy color because it's alive, whereas the fossil is just the skeleton, the limestone skeleton of the coral. So we can get a sense of coral reefs, of this same ecosystem before we started harming it, before the Anthropocene. And can also look at much younger remains of reefs right up until the present day to see what went wrong and when did it go wrong, and what can we do about it. But here's another example from that fossil reef. This is a brain coral. and it's got these little circuitous paths in it, and so it's pretty recognizable in the fossil record. And this is what a brain coral looks like alive and underwater. So it's very hard to look at these coral fossils and not think about the present day ecosystem because they're so comparable. But before we get more into the history of reefs and the fossil record and all that, I wanted to start out by making the case for why corals are awesome. Because they are awesome. And I am well aware that other marine life gets a lot more attention. There's some very charismatic creatures in the ocean, the sharks. They get a whole week. The whales, they're enormous. Turtles, dolphins, seals. I'm sure there's a lot of others. If I haven't named your favorite, please think about it in your mind. But corals are much less charismatic than all of that. They don't have eyes. They don't have teeth. They don't have a brain, but they are very important. So let me tell you why. So corals are the main reef builders in modern reefs, and some other rocky structures at colder latitudes you'll hear about them they're called reefs sometimes because they attract a lot of fish. And so there can be rocks on the seafloor for other reasons, but the reefs we're talking about today are coral reefs, which are in the tropics and subtropics. And they are primarily grown by corals. So corals grow their skeletons, and that creates habitat for a huge number of species. It's estimated that at least a quarter of all species in the ocean need a coral reef. And that's in comparison to the fact that coral reefs occupy less than 1%. I think it's 0.1% of the ocean. So these little epicenters of biodiversity on the seafloor are really important for fish, for invertebrates, for lots of marine life in the ocean. And from our human point of view, some of that life in the reefs becomes food for us, like fish. Some of it has medicinal potential, and we're still learning quite a bit about that. And healthy reefs are a huge benefit in tourist economies, too. But one of the most striking things, I think, is that coral reefs, the shallowest parts of coral reefs, which are just a few feet below sea level and offshore, they can really buffer storm waves. So when a hurricane is coming towards shore or some other storm is headed towards the land, there's a lot less flooding of coastal areas where there's a coral reef offshore. So for instance, if Jamaica's reefs had been a little stronger and more healthy, there may have been less flooding of the coast there. And I don't mean to pick on Jamaica, that's true of anywhere really, that places that have a really strong, shallow coral reef are much more protected from storm waves. So that's incredible. And it's all, those giant structures are built by these tiny little animals. So we're looking here at some coral polyps up close. Each coral animal is called a polyp, which if you're thinking about medical stuff, the word polyp isn't a very friendly word, but in terms of corals, it's a very friendly word. It just means the little coral animals. So we're zoomed in here, and each one of these little round things is one coral animal. And in this species, each individual is about the size of an eraser at the end of a pencil. So they're small. Each one of them is quite small. They look like little tiny sea anemones with a ring of tentacles around a little soft body and a mouth at their center. And they are little sea anemones, basically. They're related to sea anemones, but underneath their bodies, below those polyps, is a skeleton that's made out of calcium carbonate, and that's limestone. And that skeleton, in this example here, the skeleton is not from the same coral colony. I did not kill it to take a picture of its skeleton, and someone asked me that once, and I felt terrible that I had not mentioned that. So now I mention it. But each one of those star shapes on the skeleton is where one coral polyp lived. And over its life, it adds layer after layer of limestone to its skeleton. And corals can live for hundreds of years. Some of them live for over 1,000 years. And so year after year, these tiny little guys all together living in a colony, so there's thousands of coral individuals, of polyps in a colony, they create these massive structures, or they're able to as long as they remain alive. So all together, they can do these amazing things and create the habitat that a lot of other marine life depends on. And in part, they're able to grow their skeletons so large because they have a very special source of food. And the food comes from zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae are a little single-celled algae that live within the coral. They're part of the coral's microbiome. So here, let's see, laser pointer, each little yellowy dot here is one alga cell. So it's speckled with all these little algae. They're living within the coral, and this is a symbiotic relationship. So the coral gets something out of it. The coral gets some nutrition from the zooxanthellae because the zooxanthellae is doing photosynthesis, producing sugars for its own nutrition, but the coral takes some of that. And the zooxanthellae gets a safe place to live and some building blocks to make some carbon dioxide to make their sugars out of. So it's a win-win situation. And zooxanthellae is the name of a group. It's not a species. There's actually many different species of this algae, but it's a really important relationship, and corals have a huge microbiome, but this relationship in particular is just so essential for the corals. But as you've probably heard, sometimes water gets too warm, and the zooxanthellae, those little single-celled algae, get kicked out of the corals, and this is called coral bleaching. So I chose this photo to show you because it shows just a very small amount of coral bleaching. So let's see here, these branches here that have some white to them are bleached. Now the term bleaching is a little misleading. It has nothing to do with Clorox or anything like that. This just means that they've turned white. And they turned white because they kicked the zooxanthellae out of their tissues. So that makes the little coral polyps transparent. And we can see their white skeleton below their bodies. So those bleached corals are alive, but they're starving. They're not getting enough food. Whereas all these branches of coral, even if they have a little bit of white on them, they are healthy. They're full of that algae, and so they have enough food. And so that's how coral bleaching works. It's possible that those bleached corals can get their algae back. The algae's just in the seawater. They don't get the same cells back, but they can pull in more algae if the water temperature cools down a little bit. So that brings us to the next part of today's talk about how this is a terrible time to be a coral. And so let's look at some of the main problems that corals are facing. We saw a very small amount of bleaching before, but increasingly corals are bleaching across entire reefs, and this is called mass bleaching. So this is, all of these corals are white because they've all lost their algae, and the water temperature is warm. This picture is from the Great Barrier Reef, and this is mass bleaching. And so this can happen over an entire reef. It can happen over an entire region. It can, increasingly, it's happening, well, seasonally, but around the world in the tropics too. So those are called global bleaching, global mass bleaching events. And it's happening as climate warms and as marine heat waves get stronger and longer and more deadly. And a marine heat wave just means a heat wave in the ocean instead of in the air. Coral bleaching is a huge problem that we hear about today because of climate change, but it's not the only problem that corals face. And so this is a bit of a problem, but because we know there are other problems, we know how to solve them too. So corals also don't like murky water. They don't deal particularly well when water quality declines. And this often happens near coasts that are developed, where there's cities and towns near the coast that release sewage in particular into the water. This increases the nutrient level in reefs. And when there's agriculture near the coast and fertilizer flows into a coral reef, this is not very good for the corals. It's really great if you're a seaweed. Seaweed loves all those extra nutrients, and I have nothing against seaweed, but seaweed is not growing the structure of the reef. So it's reefs are getting, especially in areas with developed coasts, reefs are getting more covered with seaweed and less covered with corals. Disease is also a problem. This is the problem section of the talk. I promise we're going to move on to some happier news. But first, problems. So disease is particularly a problem in the Caribbean, and this is a coral off the coast of Bonaire in the southern Caribbean. And this section is just coral skeleton covered with kind of a thin bit of seaweed. There's a line of disease here. So these coral polyps are sick. There's a couple spots of disease, and these coral polyps are still healthy. Brain corals have very long coral polyps, so they're not round like the example I showed you before. But a disease like this, well, this particular disease, stony coral tissue loss disease, has been roaming around the Caribbean for about a decade now. But there have been other diseases in the past, including just a really deadly one that killed most of the branching corals in the Caribbean between the late 70s and through the 80s, basically. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But we don't know very much about coral diseases, which is amazing because so many people are researching them. It's not for a lack of trying, but there is evidence that coral diseases are tied in with the coral's microbiome, and having a healthy microbiome sometimes protects the coral from disease. There's also evidence that heat and water quality issues can affect the rate of disease in a reef. And so all of these things are kind of tied together. And the last problem we're going to talk about now is that many reefs are overfished. And there's actually been pretty excellent progress on this with marine protected areas that are increasing numbers of fish. But in reefs that have too few grazing fish, there tends to be more seaweed and less coral in the reef because there aren't enough grazing fish to eat the seaweed off the reef. So today's corals are in trouble. And learning from the past can help us understand what we can do to help. That's the tack I took in Reefs of Time. So I explore what scientists have found in past reefs, what they were like before these problems started, and then what happened when the problems started, and what sorts of things we can do today to make the situation better. So this is related to a couple of pretty new branches of science. One is called conservation paleobiology, which means looking to fossils, to the fossil record, to inform how we conserve ecosystems. And so it applies that to coral reefs. And then there's another branch of science called historical ecology that looks to the historical past instead of prehistory to see how ecosystems have changed over time. And often these are timescales where we don't have really good monitoring of things like coral reefs, and so we need to look for other evidence. And going to tell you a bit about that evidence. So to figure out, if you wanted to figure out what happened in a coral reef a couple decades ago to 100 years ago or so, you could take a look at the death assemblage. And the death assemblage in a coral reef is are the dead skeletons of corals and other reef life that are on the seafloor. And so it's a bit like a reef cemetery, the death assemblage. And of course, now that corals are dying in large numbers, there's more of this cemetery than there used to be. But even in very healthy reefs, there are some dead corals. And so you can get to know how did this reef change, if it did, over time? And the one way that researchers look at the death assemblage to understand what happened in a reef is to identify the species of coral that are found dead and the species of coral that are found alive. And if you find the same species both dead and alive, the ecosystem, or at least the corals within it, might be somewhat in balance. But if you're finding corals that are only found dead and no longer found alive, you may be looking at an ecosystem that's been in transition and been changing. So that's one way of using that death assemblage. Now, if you wanted to know what happened in a coral reef hundreds of years ago to a couple thousand years ago, you're going to need to dig a little deeper, literally. So you're going to need to look at subfossils. And subfossils are kind of this awkward age between the death assemblage on the seafloor, so those are the skeletons of dead corals and other life on the seafloor, and fossils that are encased in limestone. So subfossils are the layers of sediments below the living reef. And so here in this illustration, we've got a couple of research divers, and they are scuba diving underwater, and they are pounding a coring tool, which is basically like a giant metal drinking straw, into the seafloor. And then when they extract it, they pull up a cylinder of subfossils inside the core. And if you keep all the layers within that separate and age date them, and then identify what species are in them, you can see whether the coral reef has changed over time. There's really interesting research on how fish have changed in some coral reefs over time based on subfossils, because you can identify the fish teeth. And so there are huge numbers of fish teeth in these cores. Then we can see when their population started to decline in reefs. And then if you wanted to know what happened in coral reefs many thousands of years ago, you need to look at fossil reefs. And here's another example of a fossil reef. I just realized I left my book in here. I'm going to read you a couple pages from chapter 6. So we all go to this fossil reef. It's in the southernmost Bahamian island. It's called Great Anagua. It's just north of Cuba. And if you stand in the lighthouse on Great Anagua, you can see Cuba from the island, which is pretty cool. But this fossil reef is the same age as the one we saw before. So it formed about 125,000 years ago. So dramatic pause while I get my book. Oh no, even more dramatic pause. Okay, yeah, thank you. All right. Let's find chapter 6. Okay, here we go. It's fiercely sunny and hot on our first day at Devil's Point. Even the fossils are warm. Like many limestone fringed coasts, this one on the Bahamian island of Great Anagua is an ancient reef. Some of the limestone is creamy beige, some is dark gray, its surface weathered by phytokarst. Sally Walker darts from one spot on Devil's Point to another, joyfully exclaiming Latin species names when she spots fossils in the outcrop, as if she's meeting up with old friends. Her husband, Fausto, follows her with an umbrella, attempting to keep Sally in its shade. Often Fausto is a few steps behind Sally, unable to predict her path through the outcrop. It can be hard to know what fossil she'll make a beeline for next. Several steps behind Sally and Fausto, I'm walking the fossil reef with Al Kern and Mark Wilson, who are pointing out the evidence preserved in rocks and fossils that they and Brian White found at Devil's Point, which tell an unexpected story of what happened to Bahamian reefs during the last interglacial period. A brief drop in sea level killed shallow reef corals that were exposed above water. When sea level rose again, new corals grew in the same place. This was a place where a reef struggled and yet persisted. We'll get to know several such places in this chapter, including fossil reefs where corals died as sea level fell or rose too fast, or when climate became too variable. Even though these prehistoric crises are very different from the struggles reefs face today, the fossil evidence can hint at whether modern reefs that are struggling could someday return. In the world today, it's becoming increasingly common for reefs to not recover from disturbances, to not bounce back after a bleaching event or a hurricane, for example. They have low resilience, likely because of a confluence of factors. But over longer timescales, although still short compared to the vast expanse of geologic time, the fossil record contains numerous examples of how the ecosystem has been able to persist by rebuilding, usually with the same coral species and reef zones after a time of struggle when the corals of a previous reef were killed. One of those examples is these long ago rebuilt reefs at Devil's Point. It's January 1999, and this is my first time at Devil's Point Fossil Reef. It will become one of my research locations as I work on my dissertation. Eventually, I'll spend enough time on the island that locals will refer to me as the Devil's Point Lady, a moniker that makes me sound as if I'm the devil's apprentice, a go-to person for satanic activity rather than someone who spends her days identifying fossil clams and snails preserved in an ancient reef. As we walk, Al and Mark point out that what looks like one fossil reef is actually a stack of two reefs. A younger reef sits atop an older one. We stop every few steps and they identify which lumpy fossil outcrops are from the older reef and which are from the younger reef. In many places, the top of the older reef forms a broad, flat area, which is the easiest place to walk through the outcrop. And underfoot is clear how a brief wiggle in sea level eroded the top of the older reef. This surface, a plane between two layers of coral reef, marks a time of disruption. So, this is a picture of that time of disruption. Oop, I'll go to the next slide. This is how we cheat with photos. Okay, so the older reef is down below, and especially on the right-hand side, you can see that it's sort of leveled off. And so this happened, the top of the reef was eroded as sea level fell, and it wound up above water. The younger reef formed above the older one, obviously afterwards. And so after this time of disruption, which is the dotted line, sea level rose again. And so the corals could come back. Now, this was just a very minor change in sea level. This was during that last interglacial period. So it's very, it's a head scratcher why this happened, and people are still trying to figure out how it happened. But sea level changed probably somewhere between 5 and 20 feet. And the corals here died because they were above water, and corals can't live above water. But there was still lots of area of shallow seafloor where corals could live. And so once sea level rose again, coral larvae could come in, coral larvae float in the water and then settle down and start growing a colony to start their adult life trapped in place. They stay in place for their whole adult life. And so that could happen once the conditions were what they needed again. But there was a much larger change in sea level about 100,000 years later during the last glaciation, so the part of the ice age where there was like a mile deep ice over New York City and that kind of thing. All of that ice on land meant that there was a lot less water in the ocean, and sea level dropped about 400 feet. So this was a much bigger challenge for coral reefs. And there was a lot less space for reefs when sea level was low, mostly because of the shape of the seafloor in the tropics. So this photo shows us what the seafloor is like in the tropics, sort of a typical shape of seafloor. There's, we're looking offshore here. We're actually in a small airplane, so that's why we're above the water. But the lower half of the photo is shallow water, and it's sort of speckled because there's a lot of coral reefs and seagrass beds and other environments on the shallow seafloor. So this is a great area to live if you're a coral that is full of zooxanthellae and you need sunlight streaming through the water for the zooxanthellae to do photosynthesis. And so this is a great place to be a coral until the water gets too hot. But when sea level was low, it dropped over the edge of that very steep slope. So you see where the water turns dark blue up here. This is very deep water. So there's a very steep slope over here. And we can look at this from the side. This is kind of a typical shape of the tropical seafloor. So when sea level's high, like on the left, and like it is now, there's a lot of shallow area for reefs to grow, the little black half circles. But when sea level was low, like during the glacial period, 20,000 years ago, reef life and corals had to stick to the sides of these platforms. And it's estimated that for most areas of the tropics, there was only about 10% of the area for coral reefs that there is today. But pretty remarkably, all but 2 coral species survived this time. And theoretically, they survived by living in refugia, which are safe spaces, basically. When times are tough, this is where a wildlife retreats into refugia. So these places, these refugia, may not have ideal conditions, but species can survive for many generations in these sorts of places. And just as a side note, there's a big effort now to find refugia in lots of different ecosystems, both in the ocean and on land, that will be more protected as climate changes. So we don't know very much about fossil refugia because they are kind of needles in haystacks. It's hard to find them. But this is what a living reef refugium looks like. And I visited this reef in late 2022. And this is a place off the coast of Belize where staghorn coral, which we met earlier, survived the 20th century. It survived these decades. The last half of the 20th century, when nearly all staghorn coral died across the Caribbean. As much as 98% of the staghorn coral died across the Caribbean, and it used to be as common as this. So all the branches we're seeing here are that staghorn coral. So it died before I learned how to scuba dive, so I hadn't seen a reef like this before. But in this location, the staghorn coral didn't die. And it was dying across the Caribbean because of a very virulent disease that was just incredibly deadly, that took out a lot of staghorn coral in the 70s and 80s and somewhat in the 90s, and because of water quality declines as fertilizers, chemical fertilizers were produced, and a lot of fertilizer wound up in the Caribbean, so that increased the nutrient load in the Caribbean. So the staghorn coral, this was like a reef from a previous time, basically. It really survived at this site, and a team of researchers went there and took a look at those subfossils below the living surface of the reef, including, this is Lisa Greer, she led the research team, and they dated the corals and found that over the 20th century, this coral grew more or less continuously for at least a century, and really had no dieback, like during this time where reefs just a few miles away were decimated. So it was kind of mysterious how this reef survived. And they started then studying the coral to understand, is this particular coral more resilient? Is it more able to cope? And they were in the middle of that process when I joined them for fieldwork. So that was really fun. But unfortunately, this refugium is now gone. It died while I was writing the book. So the corals were killed in a huge marine heat wave that really enveloped most of the Caribbean in 2023. And so on the left here is how the reef looked in December of 22 when I met it. And you can see the yellow color to those coral branches. That means they're healthy. They're full of that zooxanthellae. The tips of the branches, you'll notice, are white. That's because this coral grows so fast that the new coral polyps don't yet have algae within them. So they're kind of like, uninhabited, basically, and they need to acquire that. So that's not bleaching, that's healthy coral still. But on the right, this is how the reef looked when I went back to see it in June of last year. So it had been dead at this point for about 8 months. That's the estimate. No one actually saw it die. It just all of a sudden was dead. We didn't even see it bleach. So what we're looking at on the right is dead coral skeletons on the seafloor. So this is all death assemblage now. So the heat that killed these corals killed millions of corals throughout the Caribbean, and then the heat spread worldwide in 2024 and became a global mass bleaching event. And some corals died without even bleaching. The water was so hot in some areas. But this was incredibly terrible for so many people and so many scientists who had been studying reefs like this for a long time, as well as the local communities that rely on them for fish and other food. But these corals had been protected from disease and from water quality problems, from the stressors that were killing other staghorn coral, but they were not protected from the heat, or at least not the amount of heat that we saw in 2023. So that brings us to the final part of today's talk, which is about the challenge of heat and how we can help coral reefs survive as climate warms. And so I'll just say that, coral reefs are really at a tipping point right now, and it's unclear what the future will be for coral reefs. But they could return eventually if species avoid extinction, and that's one area where we can help. But what we really need to do is limit the amount that climate warms, and the more we can limit the amount of climate warming this century, the more reefs will be able to survive. The percentages are still not very high, but more of them could survive. And if 10% of the reefs could get all the coral species, except for 2, through the last glaciation, then we might have a chance of getting all these species through this crisis as well. So we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with planting forests and grasslands, and maybe with new technologies that are kind of vacuuming it out of the air, although those are not yet working at scale as I understand it. But as I'm sure you know, it's taking us a very long time to solve this problem, and the longer it takes, the more coral reefs we're going to lose. So there's no alternative to slowing down climate change. We need to do that for a number of reasons, as I'm sure you know, but we can help buy some time to help coral species survive this really tough time and avoid extinction while we get climate under control. Because once they're extinct, it's going to be hard for reefs to bounce back. But the more coral species we can protect from extinction, the better. So I'm going to share with you a couple of strategies that researchers are using that actually kind of take into account how corals and reefs have changed over time. So one is that researchers are looking for refugia where corals are protected from heat. So not like that reef I showed you before. It may have been a refugium from other problems, but it was not protected from heat. But there are areas of the ocean where coral reefs are less likely to overheat. It doesn't mean they will never overheat. It just means that they're less likely to overheat. And so researchers are mostly using computer models, simulations of ocean currents and tides, and that kind of thing, to figure out where cooler water mixes in with warmer water so that the temperature stays a little more moderate. And so they're searching for those places with computer models, and the idea is that once those locations are found, and we can protect them from other problems like nutrient pollution and overfishing, so that corals are not dying because of other problems and they're most likely to survive. Another thing we can do is to create human-built reef refugia. So this essentially means restoring reefs in locations that have water that's less likely to overheat. So to restore a reef, corals are typically grown from fragments. Because these corals are colonial, you can take a fragment of one colony and it'll then form a new colony. It'll grow in the right conditions. It'll grow more individual polyps and add to that colony. So this is kind of a benefit of being a coral. So this coral nursery here is growing a lot of these colonies. There's a lot of different designs for coral nurseries, but this one uses ropes in shallow water just above the seafloor so that the little corals don't wind up with sand grains on them and that sort of thing. And once they're large enough, each rope is tacked down into an area of seafloor, and the corals just keep growing. So another strategy that people who are restoring reefs are using is to make sure they select corals that have more ability to tolerate heat. So this is kind of assisting evolution. And over time, we know that corals are able to grow their heat tolerance. Whether they have time to do this naturally as climate warms is completely unclear. For evolution, of course, that requires hundreds to thousands of years, and we have evidence that corals have been able to evolve heat tolerance over those sort of timescales, but climate is warming much more rapidly now than at times in the past, so we don't entirely know if this will happen naturally. And so researchers are looking into how can we speed up that evolutionary process. Oh, I should explain this photo. So we are looking at here, we are looking down at a coral reef, and a researcher named Lorenzo Alvarez Philip, a Mexican researcher, took this photo off the east coast of Mexico. So we're looking down on the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef. And everything you can see on the seafloor here are corals. But you can see that some are white, and those are bleached. Some have more of an orangey brown color, and that means they have zooxanthellae in their tissues, not bleached, they're healthy. Some are kind of light in color, and those, it's called paling, so they're sort of partially bleached, a little bit bleached. But he took this photo during the height of that 2023 heat wave. And this reef is just north of that refugia I showed you earlier, which was off the coast of Belize. So there, all the corals died. But in this site, some of the corals are healthy, some of the corals are struggling, and they're all in the same hot water. So this is one reason that we know that not all corals have the same ability to cope with heat. And so if we can help breed those corals that seem to have some ability to deal with heat, it's a much better situation. But also there's another way for corals to get more tolerant of heat, and that is acclimatization. So instead of evolutionary changes through their genes, they can have basically epigenetic changes. So genes kind of turn on and turn off when they are exposed to heat. And so researchers are finding that corals in areas where at low tide the water heats up because it's shallower, those corals seem to be better capable of dealing with heat than corals that are always in the same temperature water. So they're trying to use that kind of strategy to harden corals, basically like people harden plants before planting them outside. There's also a type of zooxanthellae that is more able to cope with heat and less likely to bleach out of corals. It's thought that the algae gets kicked out of the corals in part because in the heat, it starts to create toxins. And if you're a little coral and the algae within you is creating toxins, you want to get the whole thing out of your system. So even though it's not in their best interest to lose that food source, they kick it out. But some zooxanthellae seem to be able to survive in the heat without those sort of side effects. So we're learning a lot more about this, whether it will help us save coral reefs or help us bring them back from the brink. we're not quite sure. There's a lot of unknowns about the future, but it's quite possible that if we help species survive, help coral species survive, they'll be able to come back. So I wanted to take you back to the Devil's Point Reef in Great Inagua and that surface of disruption, that time when the earlier reef died, because we're going to zoom into that surface and take a look at some really small corals that grew right on the surface. So we're looking at these little coral colonies, and these are little things. The one on the right is probably about the size of an Oreo. So that gives you a sense of scale. So this is not a reef. These are just tiny little corals. But they're growing right on that surface of disruption. And they could have only grown there once sea level bounced back up again. So the environment was what they needed. So, once the conditions were what they needed, the larvae came in, settled down, started growing little corals. There was not a reef here at this point. These were the pioneers, the first ones to come in. But eventually, the larger reef was built on this same site. And so I guess I hold on to this as a little bit of hope that this could happen on the skeletons of dead corals that are piling up on the seafloor now. And it might take hundreds of years, it might take thousands of years, but it may happen, and we may lose some species. But the more we can slow climate change and help prevent coral species from becoming extinct, the better off we'll be. So the situation's quite dire, but there's a lot we can do to help. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for coming. And here are some of those more charismatic fauna.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions? I can bring you the microphone. Okay, hang on a second.
Hi, thank you for the presentation, really interesting. I don't know anything about this area, but I have a question for you regarding the climate change. Is it possible for, I think you called it refugia, to occur in areas that are cold now but are getting warmer because of the overall warming of oceans? Is that a possibility as well to combat against some of the extinction possibilities?
That's a possibility. And the way that paleontologists are looking at this is to look the last time the temperature was the warmest, is not as warm as it is today, but during the height of that last interglacial period, they're finding that species migrated away from the equator. And so they didn't exactly go up to the Arctic or anything, but they did seem to, not all coral species, but at least some of them migrated away from the hottest areas. So that's possible. There's a lot of other conditions that have to be taken into account, like if, for instance, as you get further from the tropics, there are still winter storms that disrupt coral reefs, like the storms that affect Florida, and a bunch of oranges die in the frost and that kind of thing. Those storms also kill corals, and so the further you get from the equator, the more you wind up in these bands that have these storms that pass through in winter and disrupt things in other ways.
The variability.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the other question that I had for you is, and I had to look this up, I think hopefully the AI search that I did is correct. I guess it's called the PETM. Are you familiar with that? I'm not going to pronounce it incorrect.
The thermal maximum?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so apparently that happened 56 million years ago. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, so that's long before all these species had evolved.
Okay, so none of the species here
No.
would have been in existence then. They would have evolved from that time.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, so that's on much larger evolutionary time spans. But you're right, there were creatures that were adapted to those conditions. Probably, it was not as rapid a change, although we don't have a lot of information about that. But often it's the rate of change that affects whether species are able to adapt. And so that's a challenge today, and why having some human intervention can help out.
Okay, thank you. I was very curious.
Well, I didn't use AI. But I remember years ago, there was great concern about the coral reef off the northwest coast of Australia and indigenous people. I'd like to know more about that. I'm not quite sure how oil and other kinds of energy sources are tied into coral reefs. And another question I have that's maybe related, maybe isn't, is places like Hong Kong, they're doing the land reclamation. I don't know in terms of where coral reefs are, but are there issues that the land is being piled up to stop the water from coming into a place like Miami Beach and otherwise affecting coral reefs to try to stop, for lack of a better word, the flooding?
Oh, okay, yeah, so, okay, wait, there was a multi-part question.
I know.
Can we go back to the first part?
I'm a bad questioner.
No, go back to the first part and repeat just that for me.
Give me an update on Australia.
Australia. Okay, so as that heat affected Caribbean reefs in 2023, it then spread worldwide and it had a huge impact on Australia's Great Barrier Reef. So that is the largest barrier reef in the world. And a barrier reef it covers a huge amount of coastline. And so the Great Barrier Reef, there was really widespread bleaching and there was a lot of coral mortality. And there's a very active science program there that tracks how reefs are doing. They have an annual report on the reefs. And I haven't seen one for this year, but the one from 2024 was pretty grim. Now, there are also a lot of coral species there, a lot more coral species there than are in the Caribbean. And some of those coral species grow pretty rapidly. So often there's more year-to-year change in the Great Barrier Reef than there are in other reefs because there is much larger species diversity. But there are areas of the Great Barrier Reef that are still, I wouldn't say pristine, but that are still relatively healthy, and there are areas that are declining pretty fast, especially the more inland areas. And I think you had a question about coastal processes too. Maybe we could.
Thank you for waiting. Question 2 buried in there.
Oh, yeah.
Had to do with energy, and question 3 had to do with land reclamation and as countries are trying to expand islands, et cetera.
Yes.
Is that affecting the coral reefs too? So I'm sorry, 3
Yes.
questions in one.
No, they're all great questions. So let's go into the islands and then come back to the energy. So you're right that as we change coastlines, we're changing the area for coral reefs underwater too. So all that coastal life under the sea surface is affected by what we do on the coast. And so in terms of these coastal islands, often, especially the most low-lying islands, often the coasts are kind of fortified with seawalls and things like that. And that often creates basically a barrier so that there aren't little places for reef life for the juveniles of a lot of reef creatures to grow up. Whereas on natural coastlines in these areas, there are mangrove trees, and in their roots, a lot of little creatures live there that become fish living on the reef. And so the coasts are really connected to what's happening on the coral reefs. And I know that we want to fortify these coasts so that, they're protected from damage, but and our communities are protected, but they're also really important for the wildlife too. So there's some understanding of that too. There's lots of projects that are planting mangrove trees and restoring coasts in natural ways. Puerto Rico has a lot of these projects. It's really kind of on the forefront, I think, planting these mangrove trees, which also protects from coastal storms and wave damage and erosion. So it's a benefit for people and for the wildlife in the reef as well. Okay. Now, this I don't know about. I thought you were asking general energy questions. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with that. I mean, I think there are a lot of land use issues in Australia related to Indigenous rights that I'm certainly no expert on, but I'm gonna look that up.
Yeah, I have a question about this 2023 heat wave. What was the actual cause of death of corals in Caribbean?
The cause of the corals' death,
Or at
dying.
least, what's the current theory?
Well, the ocean overheated, so there was massive coral bleaching, and the ocean, we've never recorded, we have about 100-year record of ocean temperatures in the Caribbean, and there has never been a year like 2023 on record. The heat came earlier in the spring. It stayed hot later into the fall. And usually, I mean, because seasons exist, it's always warmer in the summer than it is in the winter, even in the Caribbean.
Yeah, no, actually, I would like to know why heat in this particular case caused massive death. What was the reason? Was it like infection? Was it algae overgrowth or?
It was the losing that zooxanthellae, so the coral bleaching. So these coral branches here just have a little bit of bleaching. So when a coral bleaches, it loses the algae that lives inside its tissues. So these little alga cells here. So when it loses that algae, it's losing a big source of its food. I mean, a lot of corals, more than half of their food come from the photosynthesis that the little algae are doing. So when they bleach, like, you know, in large numbers like this, all of these white corals, we're looking at corals that have lost their algae, so they're transparent now. We're looking at their skeletons, basically, through their little bodies, and that means they're starving. So we're looking at hungry corals, and the longer they stay bleached, the more chance that they're gonna starve to death. So if the water temperature cools after a couple weeks, they may be able to survive that, you know, with limited food. They also hunt with their tentacles, so they, you know, they're stuck in place. They can't move around, but they can pull plankton out of the water and into their mouth. And so they do get some food, but usually that's not a huge part of their diet. So they just have a lot less food, so they're starving to death. And there was some cases reported during 2023 of corals that basically just poached because the water heated up so much. So instead of bleaching first and having this kind of vulnerable stage where they're not getting enough food, they actually just died of the heat. It just got too hot for them to survive. But most of the corals bleached, and then because the heat lasted for such a long time in 2023. I mean, by May, it was extraordinarily hot, and then it stayed hot well into October. And so some corals were still bleached in the winter. And I was calling scientists in January who were saying, yes, the corals are still bleached. And so, you know, some corals have been living with very limited food for months and months, and a lot of them could not survive that. But.
I'll let somebody who hasn't asked a question. I also have a million questions, but I'll hold.
Yeah, I don't know if my information's correct, but doesn't climate change have an impact on the pH of the ocean water? And
Yes.
so does that have any impact on?
Yes. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So this is called ocean acidification. And so as we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, a lot of that carbon dioxide gets taken up by the ocean, which is actually sort of great for us because it means climate doesn't warm as fast as it could. But with that extra carbon dioxide in the ocean becomes a little bit acidic. So if you're an animal that needs to build your skeleton or shell out of limestone, it's going to become much more difficult for you to do that. And corals are affected by that. It looks like corals are most vulnerable when they are very young. So when the larvae first settle down and start to grow their colony, obviously they're just starting to grow their colony, so any obstacle to that makes life a lot harder, whereas an older coral colony seems to be a little more resilient to that. But a lot of other marine life, clams and oysters and all sorts of other things that need to build their shells are also affected by ocean acidification. So that's a growing problem.
I just realized the time, and I want everyone to have a chance to buy your wonderful book.
Why, thank you.
So please join me in thanking Lisa Gardiner for her really wonderful talk, and please buy her book.
Thanks for coming.